about how central bankers and supervisors support climate risk and green finance and manage these risks. Since our inception in 1998 as a nonprofit organization, Toronto Centre has trained more than 15,000 central bankers and supervisors from 190 countries and territories to build more stable, resilient, and inclusive financial systems. In 2016, we began incorporating climate change in our capacity building programming because of the substantial implications for global financial stability and risk of crisis from climate change. Indeed, we were one of the very first organizations that looked at capacity building. To this extent, Toronto Centre congratulates FSB's roadmap that led to the establishment of the Climate Training Alliance for Supervisors, with the participation of standard setters, BIS, and a whole bunch of other positive actors. Naturally, Toronto Centre stands ready to contribute the lessons we have learned and support this alliance in every way possible. In the aftermath of the devastating impact of the global pandemic on economies and people's livelihoods, this proactive crisis preparedness is essential for all countries to mitigate against the impact of climate shocks. This is the fourth webinar this year since June 2021. So far, we have heard about the challenges and ongoing efforts on climate risk by national authorities, international standard setters, and networks such as the Basel Committee and the Network for Greening the Financial System. Speakers highlighted the importance of tackling climate risk, as well as the necessity of international coordination and information sharing to learn from each other. Now, it is indeed a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome our distinguished speakers. They are leading their nation's supervisory efforts to tackle these challenges and are great international influencers. His Excellency Alejandro Diaz de León Carrillo is the governor of the Central Bank of Mexico. He was also chosen as the best governor of the year. Sabine Moderer is the member of the executive board of Deutsche Bundesbank. Welcome, Sabine. Welcome, Governor. Toronto Centre's mission is generously supported by Global Affairs Canada, Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, the IMF, Jersey Overseas Aid, Comic Relief, and the United States Agency for International Development. We will have 3 rounds. I will pose 3 questions to each speaker, and then I will take questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A tab to submit your questions. I would appreciate if the audience directed their questions in a very precise and concise way rather than long statements. Also, I'm pleased to say that we have basically quite a lot of countries here. I think I've counted over 60 countries attending, representing all the letters of alphabet, all the way from Argentina, Antigua to Zambia and Zimbabwe and every letter in between. So welcome, everyone. So my first question is going to go to Sabine. Sabine, how can central banks integrate climate risks into their monetary policy frameworks? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Barak, and thank you for inviting me to speaking to this distinguished audience. Let me put your question in a little bit broader set. I think the first question is, in which areas in general does climate change a role when you look at our mandates or other tasks? And there, I think it's clearly, as you mentioned, monetary policy, especially when we look at, prices, price dynamics. You see the energy prices will also due to climate policies increase. You see food prices in Brazil rising. And so pricing, also outcome, will play a role, and therefore, we have to reflect this in our models and in other way. Also, asset purchase programs will be affected. I might come to that later. And in other regard, we also have the mandate of financial stability. There it's clear that we have to look at climate change and the impact on the economy, on the financial stability. what we there do or intend to do is to set up different scenarios so as to have an understanding what kind of, especially political decisions will have what kind of impact on the economy, or missing timely actions, what will this mean for the economy? And the third pillar, which is very important, is most of us have also the mandate for banking supervision, and there, of course, climate change will play a crucial role. And we, in the Eurosystem, we start with stress testing, also with climate scenarios. And we will ask our financial institutions to mitigate their financial risks that come from climate risk.
Thank you, Sabine. If I may ask you a follow-up question, would it be reasonable for me to deduce from your answer that climate risk is no longer an exogenous risk, but is really considered as a mainstream risk for financial supervisors? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely. So you just mentioned the network for greening the financial system, set up 3.5 years ago by central bankers and supervisors. And the main reason why this was set up was because so many central banks and supervisors have seen climate risk as a financial risk. And we started with Banco de Mexico, but also with Bundesbank and others to establish this network with only 8 members, having this idea, oh, this is a major threat, financial threat. And now we have 95 members. So that shows a big acknowledgement of the recognition of climate risk as a financial risk.
Thank you. Governor, my next couple of questions are to you. Let me start by talking about the fact that there are 3 essential risks when it comes to climate change, especially in the financial sector. The top 2 are physical and transition risks. So in your view, what is the relevance of physical and transition risks associated with climate change for emerging and less developed economies' financial systems? Thank you.
Well, first, it's an honor to be in this panel, Babak. Thank you very much for having me here, and let me say hi to Sabine. Let me start saying that the world is exposed to risks that, even though we know that they are present and they could materialize, they are so infrequent that they tend to be poorly understood, underappreciated, and inadequately managed. For example, we cannot argue that the current pandemic was unforeseen, but still, we were not prepared to prevent it or even to mitigate its costs. Climate change is a highly complex, infrequent, but very material risks that affects all our countries and sectors. We need to develop more detailed plans and a deeper understanding of its impact to the economy and the financial system. This is not, I think, hypothetical. Physical and transition risks are already occurring and are part of the financial authorities' agenda. We need to upgrade our economy's resilience and prepare the financial system to manage these risks. Although uncertainty remains about the exact severity and time horizon of some of the climate change consequences, small changes in temperature could have severe nonlinear consequences for our well-being, and delayed action is likely to significantly increase risks and costs. Climate change can have major effects on our economies and financial system. This involves directly central banks, as Sabine was mentioning, and especially if we consider that our mandates include price stability, output stability, and also financial stability mandate. The emerging and less developed economies' climate change will be highly disruptive, at least in 4 dimensions. First, it can induce a significant reallocation of capital flows. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which was only launched last December, has $43 trillion resources in signatories that represent almost half of the assets managed globally. This conveys a significant reallocation capital risks for emerging markets. Second, it can disturb trade and supply chains and also FDI. Mexico is a very open economy. We have more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. 12 free trade agreements with 46 countries, including the USMCA, and free trade agreements with the European Union, the European Free Trade Area, Japan, Israel, and 10 countries in Latin America. We're among the 10 largest recipients of foreign direct investment. Roughly 50% of FDI comes from North America, 40% from Europe, and 10% from the rest of the world. Misalignment in decarbonization pathways could affect demand for Mexican products and also the attractiveness to invest in the country. Being a very open and integrated economy, Mexico faces potentially significant transition risks. Let me go to the third, which is higher carbon prices. Carbon prices are critical to incentivize energy efficiency gains and a reallocation of resources from high to low carbon activities. Estimates of the global shadow price to reduce emissions typically project the need for substantial increases in carbon prices. This can entail significant transition risks for carbon-intensive emerging and developing economies, which lack domestic investment resources and fiscal policy space to cope with this challenge. And finally, in terms of financial distress, I think physical and transition risks can have a significant direct, indirect, and contagion effects in our financial systems that we need to address promptly by financial supervisors and regulators, basically to mitigate this potential systemic impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the fact that there are some similarities with what you said and the situation in Canada, like Mexico. I mean, first of all, we are North American free trade partners, I guess, but the name has changed now, right? It's a different names. Then it's, you see, whatever, I forgot, I keep forgetting. I have to keep
USMCA.
Exactly. And also, like yourselves, we are very much of an export-oriented country, and it's in our interest to have a lot of export agreements with others. And what's interesting and striking is that as governments make significant strides in addressing physical risks, right away they're thrown into transition risk, right? It's just one of those things that is back to back. So very important. So let me continue with you. So your institution, Banco de Mexico, is a founding member of the NGFS. So congratulations on that. What do you think should be the approach of central banks in emerging and less developed economies for financial institutions and markets to price climate-related financial risks better?
Well, we have established a solid institutional framework to foster this agenda. Last year, the Mexican Financial System Stability Council established a sustainable finance committee to assess the risks that sustainability and climate change may pose to the financial stability in Mexico. And the committee set up a roadmap and 4 working groups on sustainable taxonomy, capital mobilization, risk management, and disclosures and standards. The committee has also proven to be a useful platform to engage with the private sector, and the private sector associations are observers to the committee, which I think it is very useful. Also, our efforts have been concentrating on leading financial institutions in 4 areas. One is addressing data gaps, particularly regarding financial relevant data, generating consistent, reliable, and comparable data, first on climate-related risks, and then on sustainability more broadly. I think it is critical. Second, promoting the adoption of relevant standards and metrics that help us understand and tackle these risks. I think the IFRS movement in developing a baseline for global reporting standard that builds up on the TCFD framework and the work of sustainability standard setters is essential. And this will involve a wide range of stakeholders in the process, including emerging economies, which I think it's very important. Third, enhancing disclosure of financial and non-financial firms in our jurisdictions. And I think we should foster 3 things. 1, corporate disclosure commitments. Second, having taxonomies that reflect differences on the needs and priorities of each country, but also allow for international comparability. And third, to promote broad adoption of ESG criteria and foster transparency on the methodologies of ESG rating service providers. And fourth, I think that we need to upgrade risk management practices to include climate-related risks among financial institutions. I think we should carefully and continuously monitor traditional financial risks. Climate-related risks should become part of that routine risk management. And I think the regulators need to understand that capital requirements may be not necessarily the best way to approach these new risks. And I think that we should double down on using stress tests and long-term scenario analysis for these climate-related risks. I think the NGFI's scenarios provide a very good starting point in this respect to facilitate comparability. And all financial intermediaries should be subject to a minimum disclosure and risk management practice related to climate risks. And also be aware that applying climate-related regulation only to banks and certain financial institutions could have significant unintended consequences, including disintermediation and risk shifting. So we think it is very important that it applies to all and not just to the ones that we can regulate more closely.
Yeah, and one of the points that you talked about is disclosure, and I think you probably have been encouraged the G7 back the mandatory disclosure. So there seems to be a lot of momentum being built up right now in these general areas that we have talked about. Sabine, let's come back to you and your areas in Europe and elsewhere. What is the role of data and disclosure in addressing climate risks, and what can central banks and supervisors do to improve the availability of data? So I guess that's sort of related to that disclosure thing we were talking about. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. So data is the new gold, and this is also true for when you want to analyze the threat of climate change, right? And actually, you know, data are crucial to really either to identify, you know, the scenario or to prepare the scenario analysis. We have done this in the NGFS or also on the European level, and we will continue to do so because, of course, the lack of data also means that we have a lot of uncertainty. So what we need is better data, more data. And so the question is, how do we get this data, right? And and your question is very crucial. What can central banks actually do to, you know, enhance the availability of data? So what we do in the Eurosystem is that we just last week decided that we will require from 2023 on for our asset purchase programs and also for our collateral, a kind of transparency when it comes to climate risk. And the question is, well, as central banks, we could set our own requirements, but we decided to ask rather the government, the European Union, to set up decent disclosure rules so we can rely on that. So, and I think that in doing so, in requiring as a central bank data or, you know, disclosure from either the issuers or from the banks that bring in collaterals, or what we also do is we do ask in the future the credit rating agencies for transparency. So to tell us, we ask them to tell us in the future, how did you integrate climate risk into your credit rating? So this all shows that data are crucial, will become more and more important, that we need more data. Therefore, disclosure regimes are crucial. Let me just point out one thing. What I think is very important is that we do have comparable data, you know, and therefore it is also very important that we have on a global level a certain understanding what kind of data do we want to have, and how do we manage to let them be a little bit, at least a minimum comparable, right?
Sabine, thank you. I think it's actually a very important point, and not only has systemic stability considerations, but also I think for consumer protection. I mean, just to give you an example, if you go and look into any fund that talks about ESG, probably the European situation is the same. There's such a massive hunger from the public to go into these funds, but when you look at the ETFs and mutual funds, you really don't know what is what, right? And sometimes the same bank or institution that they beat up on another area is on this fund, but with a much higher management expense ratio. So that's just one example. So the work that you're doing is so critical to clarify and bring those standards and create a sense of uniformity so that us as investors, as the public, at least, know what are we getting into when we invest in our retirement or education plans for our children and all that. So yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, maybe just to add one point, I think disclosure and we as central banks forcing disclosure is so crucial because so far the climate risk as a financial is not reflected as it could be in the market. And this has to do with an intransparency. And therefore, I think it's also up to us, at least to the extent we can do this, to foster disclosure and transparency.
Yeah, and also it connects back to an earlier point that the governor made about ESG. So Governor, let me turn back to you now to ask you to please elaborate on how we can generate capital mobilization and investment in climate mitigation and adaptation in Mexico and basically the emerging market countries in general. Thank you. And do you see any challenges there?
Yes, the agenda for the mobilization of climate-related finance is very much, I think, focused on advanced economies. In emerging economies and less developed countries, issues and strategies that are needed to advance the agenda in the region are not necessarily adequately being identified. And let me put one example of high concentration of green investments in advanced economies that can be seen in capital markets by the issuance of green and sustainable related bonds and loans from 2015 to 2020. Excluding China, the share of emerging markets represented only 11% of the total volume globally. And including China, that number increases to 18%. So clearly, we are lagging behind in terms of financing deployment in this space. With the right incentive and policies, emerging markets could make a substantial contribution to mitigation efforts. Also, given the current initial conditions, any amount invested in climate change mitigation in emerging markets and lower income countries can have a larger decarbonization impact, and thus a larger positive externality than in developed countries. A dollar invested in emerging markets can have a higher mitigation potential. Does it make sense to create the conditions for such investments to be made? It would be, I think, unfortunate that we underinvest in this area. And according to an IMF recent paper, many of the world's lowest cost mitigation opportunities exist in emerging and developing countries. Thus, I think it's in the global best interest to put in place the mechanisms to channel the resources this way, and to revert from a bad equilibrium with high financing costs and insufficient green investment in emerging and developed economies to a climate-friendly funding resources at scale for these countries at genuinely low financial costs. And I think we need to acknowledge that emerging countries and less developed countries have less space to spend on climate-friendly projects than even they had before COVID-19 pandemic. So the policy space is shrinking, the need is larger, and we need to look into ways to unlock attractive international funding from advanced economies at low interest rates, I think in exchange for credible decarbonization efforts. This will, I think, will increase the resilience and move the agenda forward. And now, which type of resources and which type of instruments can be put into play? I think that we can develop blended finance structure that can unlock private sector financing to the transition to a low carbon economy. I think that we could use loan guarantees schemes as a way to de-risk some of these solutions. You can even say that Exim banks in advanced economies could design new programs to unlock some of these green investments. And also that multilateral development banks could play a role at putting some of these loan guarantees in order to leverage some of these opportunities. So I think we need to be very flexible. I think we need to be mindful of the opportunity and channel more resources into the region.
Governor, I have to tell you, you get the Toronto Centre Oscars for really compacting such a vast area of information in a very, very concise way. Thank you. And you touched on a few important things. I mean, there's almost seems like a geographical climate justice issue here. You have climate change makers. Many of them are in the advanced developed countries, not exclusively, but there, and climate change takers. Many of them in emerging market countries, but not exclusively. But then what is the role of each? And, you know, the pandemic. So thank you for connecting those dots. I think that's going to come in very handy in our Q&A session as well. Sabine, let me turn to you for the last structured question. I already see a number of questions, so we're very eager to get there, but, you know, obviously take your time on this one. which measures can central banks take to help to scale up green finance? So how do we actually create some scale here? Thank you.
Well, the question, first of all, is this the task of central banking to scale up green finance? I think we have to distinguish between our mandate price stability. And as I explained, here are areas where climate change matters and we have to mitigate the risk. And this whole, our task when it comes to monetary policy is a risk approach. So it's a reactive tool we are doing. On the other hand, we do have tasks and some central banks have mandates where, there is room for scaling up green finance. Let me take, third-party portfolios, own or pension funds, and all stuff like there. I think it's clearly up to us to take over responsibility and invest also sustainable. What I think is very important, and I think one of the questions that was also raised is, what actually, how can we raise the awareness of, this urgency, the urgency of acting towards the governments or the political decision makers? And this, I think, really relates to our massive analytical capacity, right? We do have the credibility and we do have data, a lot of data. And we do have the analytical power. So let me take just the scenario analysis. They clearly show that you have to act now and to avoid too little too late. So, showing this to the governments really means something, right? And I think your question, how can we scale up green finance? I think this is really crucial, that we use our capacities and competencies and our credibilities and to show or to prove the urgency towards especially the political side.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So that was very good. For this questions from the audience, Governor, I think I'm going to try to see the first one. You have addressed some of it, but it's an opportunity for you to see if anything else that you wanted to add. What are some of the challenges that emerging and less developed economies may face in managing or assessing climate change risk? So is there anything you would like to expand on what you have said already?
Well, probably I would highlight one of the key things that was discussed this weekend in Venice. And obviously climate change was a key issue throughout the meetings. But the IMF suggested the introduction of a minimum carbon price system. And then here the question is, how can we generate traction for this? The adoption of a one-size-fits-all approach can face, I would think, several challenges. And in this regard, adjusting these potential minimum price for income per capita and carbon intensity could improve policy coordination and convergence. And I think the challenge we're going to see how with different levels of development, we can have these minimum carbon price that it is much needed to really set the price signal to reduce carbon usage and carbon emissions. I think it's critical. And I think this is one of the challenges that we're going to face. How do we put in place the right incentives for all countries in a way that we all move in the right direction at the right speed, at the speed that it is attainable for each of the different range of countries, and in a way that it is inclusive and I would say comprehensive.
Yeah, maybe I just would like to add, because I fully agree. I think first of all, I think it's a major progress that at least at the G27, it is accepted that implementing a decent climate CO2 tax or carbon tax is the most efficient way of cope with climate risk. But everybody is aware of this political difficulties, right? Especially in countries developing and emerging markets, but also in the developed worlds, right? So the social tensions that, will go in line or might go in line with rising energy prices are, for me, the most important thing to tackle. So, and that was also one of the major point that was discussed, at least at the climate conference of the G20, as we really, or how to implement a social net globally to allow, the transition and the adjustment, but, not, and to, convince people, right? And therefore, I think the social aspect is crucial.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And remember, we were talking yesterday in preparation for this, and central bankers are under a lot of pressure by civil society, by governments. And then there's another question here for you. Let me ask the question and give the context behind it that I think is useful for our audience is, how can central banks support broader climate action by governments? So if you can pause on that one for a second. The way I look at it is governments have the key levers of decision here and key issues that can really affect the change and the speed of the change. So carbon pricing is an example. And one form or another, each government is doing whatever they can, maybe they're dragging their feet, whatever, but then it is the role of the central bankers to kind of help understand the impact, the stresses. So how do you think central bankers can help governments in trying to achieve their overall objectives and international consensus that's emerging? Sorry, you're muted. You're muted.
I thought I addressed it already, but I think, and maybe my personal experience is that, pointing out the different scenarios, what happens if they do not act, really shows them that they need to act. And then, of course, with the different scenarios, we raise the awareness of what do they have to do by when, right? And the second thing is, it's about carbon taxation. We clearly can, use our analytical capacities there when it comes to disclosure regime. And the third point, I think, is also about sustainable finance, because I think there's a lot of in the market going on. And the question, at least here in Europe, is, how can we avoid greenwashing? How, nevertheless, can we allow the transition? Because what we now see is a tendency to only focus on green products. And, for us, and I think that's globally the same, it is about the transformation of the whole economy. Otherwise, if we do not manage to transform the whole economies, especially the traditional ones where our wealth focus on or relies on, we not manage, because then we do have the social tensions. And therefore, I think also from the central bank perspective, what I usually do is also to give some advice regarding sustainable finance.
Very good. That's a good elaboration on your earlier points that actually helped round it out better. Thank you so much.
I don't know if I can add something quickly, Babak.
Of course.
I think that there's always these like two speeds. One is the political movement towards moving this direction, and the other is the financial sector and financial sector authorities. And I think sometimes the political support can have its ups and downs. I think what it is very important is that we make this part of the standard risk management challenge that financial systems need to address. I think we need to advance through the financial regulation, making this part of the ongoing way to manage risks. I think we need to align incentives in the right direction. We know that politically, we may have, as I said, ups and downs in terms of support for this agenda and for the internalization of these risks, because it includes costs. But nonetheless, I think we central banks who have a long-term horizon on things, stability is literally defined in a long horizon, either price stability, output stability, or financial stability. So we have to focus on our long-term horizon and try to put the right incentives so that we increase the cost to deviate from the right policies in the right time horizon.
Very good. Thank you. Governor, there's another question from the courageous Anonymous. In your opinion, what role could be played by the IMF and other multilateral development institutions to foster the green agenda. You did talk about, you alluded to IMF earlier on, so I'm wondering if that would be a good point for you to elaborate.
I think not only the IMF, MDBs, or even international bodies like the G20 and so on, I think they have a huge role to play. When externalities are involved, countries and national agendas are insufficient to get to the right solution and get to the right outcomes. So I do believe that climate change is almost, together with these pandemics and the challenges we go forward, those are two critical examples on how international coordination and international bodies can be of utmost importance to coordinate us in the right direction and also to force the speed. I think we are behind the curve in terms of what we need to be doing. And Sabine was mentioning how we need to move forward and in a very decisive way. And I think for that to take place, for that to happen, we need all the positive and negative incentives to move in that direction.
Thank you. There's a question here addressed to both of you. So Sabine, I'm wondering if I can start with you. Does Europe have plans to make TCFD disclosures? If the governments don't do it, can central banks and other financial supervisors make this disclosure by supervised entities mandatory? And we talked about earlier that G7 backed mandatory disclosures, making them mandatory. If this does not happen, we will have, in that case, will we have adequate data? Because you talked about data as well. I'm wondering what's your take on this question?
Well, in Europe, we actually review our disclosure rules, and it's clear that the rules are not sufficient so far, because we left out a lot of sectors or even corporates. And the second limit is that usually either you can comply or explain. And the third restriction is that, it is not really quantitative, but rather qualitative. And, as long as you do not get the right data, comparable data by, disclosure regimes, it's of no use, right? Because we all know if there isn't a report on page 322, footnote 6, saying, well, everything is okay, that's useless, right? So we have to get there. In Europe, we do have, a review in place. And furthermore, the IFRS is planning to set up global standards based on TFCD as well. So I think this would also be very helpful if we see there on a global level comparable extra data in this regard. I do not believe that we will see no progress, but still, since the question of what can central banks do, that's what I mentioned earlier. It's like, if we have data requirements, if we take collaterals in or buy assets or, to accept credit ratings, we ask also for disclosure. I think we have a lot of market power, and therefore I think we do a lot in this regard.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very useful connecting of the threads the way you did that. And I really like your example of, what did you say? Footnote 3 on page 300. I mean, if you remember, it's not about quantity of disclosures, the quality, right? I mean, we all know that Enron did not collapse because they did not disclose. It's just that there were thousands and thousands of pages. So thank you for putting that in perspective. Governor, I'm going to turn the same question to you. Does Mexico have plans to make TCFD disclosures? If governments don't do it, can you in central bank have an influence in that? And also, what happens if these are not made mandatory in terms of the data that you need?
Well, as I mentioned before, Mexico is very integrated in terms of trade and financial flows. And I would say Mexico development in the last decades have relied significantly on being, I would say, an agile and an attractive destination for capital. And we need to set our standards in harmony with international determinations. And in that regard, I think it will do us more good than harm to move forward in this direction and try to adopt these standards the sooner the better. And I think we need to find the right incentives to try to lead in this effort and try to receive additional investment, greener investment. I think we have a CapEx challenge. I mean, we need lower carbon infrastructure and production throughout the world. That is a CapEx challenge. So I think we need to set the right incentives in order to move earlier.
Thank you. Governor, I want to ask you about, there's a couple of questions here on stakeholders, and I know, Sabine, you have brought it up, but there's a lot of interest in this area. So I want to spend just a little bit of time on this because it's a pretty complicated topic. And sometimes some things are worth repeating over and over. So Sabine, what level of collaboration should be there, should be there among various stakeholders, private, public sector, government, central banks on climate-related risks? Like, how can we all sort of get along, right? Rather than screaming at each other from across and then protesting. Like, looks like there's a lot of mobilization. So what do you find as a more constructive approach to this?
Well, this is actually, you cannot talk often enough about that because, we only manage this major threat, global threat, if, we work hand in hand. And this the public and the private sector have to work hand in hand. So, I mean, we need the governments for setting the right, framework. We have our task of central banks we have discussed. We do have the real economy who needs to manage the transition. We do have the consumers who have to adjust their, their behavior. We do have the academia who really has to come up with a lot of studies and part of the real economy, but we need really a lot of innovation, right? And that's what we are, especially in Germany, focusing on is how, decreasing CO2 emission. Of course, we established a CO2 price, and but it's not only by avoiding, something, but we need technology that allows us to get to net zero by 2050. And in countries like Germany, where we rely on really traditional and rather brown industries, for us, innovation is key. So what we have to do is the government has to, enhance the public-private partnerships. What we do is we set up funds where we trigger private money. So it's a public-private partnership via financing projects and innovation. And there are so many other things. So what we really have to do is to work hand in hand. Yeah, maybe one thing, what especially for the developed world is crucial, but I think there's a big chance also for the emerging markets and the developing countries is what we would like to do and do already is to force the startups to force the innovation by the upcoming, generation, because this is something where we really see, okay, they might help us. And I just listened at the G20 conference to a lady from an Indice company who said, well, listen, the most important companies we see today have not been on our radar and didn't even exist 30 years ago. So the companies which we will rely on within the next 2 decades, we probably do not know today, or maybe they even do not exist. So therefore, because we are facing such a major change, right? And therefore, I think we all have to foster this innovation and to work hand in hand.
Yeah, Sabine, you're forcing us to think here, because we need less people to stand on the sidelines and throw stones and more people to create tools, right? In fact, if you look at some of the scientists' predictions, some are saying that all the efforts in reducing carbon emissions is great and should continue, but we're almost reaching a point where we actually need to have technology that goes and extracts carbon from the atmosphere, right? And so that means that a lot of people have to contribute in this area, right? And it is a big effort. And Governor made reference to the pandemic, and an analogy that was explained to me, I think, by Governor Carney is, it's kind of like climate change is kind of like a pandemic, moving slower, but there's no ability to self-isolate or to inoculate ourselves with vaccination, right? So we're really, as a species, we're marching towards this.
Yeah, maybe may I just add one point, because I saw that that was about the discussion in the chat about capital requirements, and I fully agree that, I think banks anyhow are already struggling. But the question is, how do we finance this transition? Because bank-based financing will have its limits, because it's very risky. Innovation means, or startup scene means, 1 out of 20 will have success, right? So it's very risky, and so the banking industry will have its limits. So what is crucial is the capital markets, to develop the capital market. So, I mean, in the US, it's clear. For Europe, it's underdeveloped. It's not that mature like in the US. And so what for us in Europe is crucial to develop and to deepen the capital markets to allow to finance the transition and the innovation.
Thank you. Governor, there's a question here. It's a two-part question. I think the second part is a fairly important one. I mean, both are important, but this one is: efforts to incentivize green financing may result in increase of credit risks and consequently credit costs to financial institutions. Some of those risks need to be borne by the relevant stakeholders, including governments responsible. How would you address the issue of such credit risk pass-through to financial institutions, which may potentially affect financial stability? Thank you.
Well, let me, if I can, some thoughts on the previous reflection, which I think it's important, in terms of how can we create a better dynamic to move forward and get away from this finger pointing of who is to blame for where we are and who is to blame for not moving to where we should be. I think we need to acknowledge that there is shared responsibility. And it's not only even at the international level, at the national level, it's not only politicians. At the end of the day, it's not also the companies that are polluting. At the end of the day, even us as consumers have been paying lower prices than what we should, because we have been using more carbon than what we should. So we are all part of the problem, and we need to be all part of the solution. And so, number one, we need to share the responsibility of the problem broadly. And number two, which is related to the question, I think there is a huge opportunity. The so-called global savings glut that has depressed interest rates, especially in advanced economies, throughout the yield curve, even into negative territory, something that was unexpected years ago. I think it creates an opportunity that we should be creative in terms of how to mitigate sovereign risks and credit risk of different counterparts in order to have these resources mobilized in the right direction for the right investments for the right reason. And this, I think, is where we are still not there. I'm seeing a lot of the agenda that takes place more into some countries that have moved a lot and made a lot of progress on this front, but not necessarily in a way that it is orchestrated at the global sphere and that includes everyone. And I think I truly think that with the flexibility to devise the right financial vehicles to mitigate risk, to have some risk sharing, either with large pools, and we all know these examples. For example, we all in all of our countries, we finance small and medium companies, and we know that you can provide loan guarantees and pool them, and you reduce the risk, and you can reduce the cost of funding for small and medium companies. The same thing could happen globally for green investments. And if we do that, I think we could fast forward into a better place.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. One question I want to pose to both of you is, it's interesting to get your perspective on this. Both of you are at the forefront of thinking about these issues, international conversations, and have a very progressive mindset. But there are still folks in the supervisory central banking community and also in the parliaments that you respond to that are very skeptical, not so much about climate change, but skeptical about the role of supervisors and central bankers in that area. Why are you taking your eyes off the credit risk and all the other things that are happening and spending time on climate? Can I ask you to respond to those skeptics? Sabine, let's start with you and then we go to the governor. Thank you.
Well, that's an easy one because, you know, climate risk is also part of the credit risk. It has become one. So we not even need to implement new risk in banking supervisions. One can do that, but, you know, they all, you know, those risk or these categories of risk are already existing. And this is just one part of it, right? A new one. And so the question is not, well, you know, what are you doing there? You know, those risks unfortunately matter to all kind of things we do or we are responsible for, be it price stability, you know, or be it supervision, or be it financial stability, right? So, you know, but you are absolutely right. Well, I have also been in a hearing at parliaments, and those questions arise always. It's about mission creep, right? It's about what is your stake in that, right? And what I must admit is that we really have to distinguish between being proactive, you know, promoting certain kind of policies. That's not our task. We are, you know, because we have to stick to our mandate. But at the same time, we really have, you know, to address the climate risk the economy is facing.
Thank you. I think next time someone challenges me on that, I'm going to say, Sabine told me the answer is very easy. No, but actually you produced a very interesting way of looking at it. You're right. I mean, we have to move on from this, but there are people who think that, hey, don't take your eyes off the ball. There's going to be another. I mean, they always fight the last war, right? So it's important to look at. Governor, from where you sit, what's your perspective on this issue? Because I'm sure you've dealt with having to, on the one hand, promote these things and defending them at the same time.
Well, first of all, as Sabine mentioned, I think climate change, it will manifest as credit risk. If not, you can ask PG&E in California with one of the biggest Chapter 11 that we saw a few years ago. I think there's no argument in that. So even if it's in your blind spot, that doesn't mean that there's something there. So it will materialize as significant credit risk. So we need to be mindful of it. And the second is, let's imagine that for any reason, there is still some uncertainty in how bad this could look, and there's a good scenario and a bad scenario. I think there's a clear risk asymmetry in a type 1 or type 2 error that usually economists tend to mention. If we get this wrong and we don't do anything and the bad scenario materializes, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be a disaster. And if we, for some reason, do the right things that we think are the right things, and there's not so much need for that, well, we're not going to be in such a bad place anyway. So just in a very crude way of trying to literally ensure our well-being in a multi-horizon format, it is very clear that we have to move in that direction. Even if there are some people that think that there is not definite proof about X or Y, I think just the asymmetries of the potential shocks and so dramatic the contrast of the scenarios is sufficient enough for us to be moving in this direction.
Very correct. And also not only that, but I mean, think of it this way, connecting to earlier point that I made, which is central bankers, supervisors, as powerful and influential as they are, they don't have the ultimate policy lever that a government has in terms of setting a price or whatever. You are by definition in a proactive, reactive way, if you will, right? Getting your systems ready. So any disaster, the finger of blame will be pointed to you, Sabine, and your colleagues, and when in fact the problem may have emerged somewhere else. So it's very good for you to be right on top of that. So we're coming to the end of this, and I'm wondering, Governor and Sabine, is there any point that you would like to leave with our audience before I close this session? Your explanations were excellent. Is there anything that you were not able to communicate? Please go ahead. Sabine, with you. Let's start with you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, especially to the audience that you kept all the time. I just have a look at the numbers and I'm impressed. This is all
actually it's more often than you see. So just to let you know.
Yeah, and I would love to hand out to every country that is not part of the NGFS, of the Network for Greening the Financial System, we do still lack a lot of, emerging or developing countries in our network. And I really urge you to think about it, and you can reach out to me. Why is that so important? Because, you will suffer the most probably. And some of your countries are already facing climate change and the effects of that. And for us, that is very important, because this is an experience we would integrate into our work. So therefore, if you have the chance to think of it, I would be very grateful. Thank you.
Sure, and we'll be very happy to promote that message, through the network of contacts and courses that we have and governors that we know. But thank you for that. Governor, yourself, you made a very eloquent points here. Is there anything, words of advice, cautions, fear, hope that you want to leave with us?
Well, I would just say that we know that sometimes the political winds on this agenda can be erratic. And I think we have to make the most out of the opportunities when they are aligned, and try to safeguard the agenda in a way that can ensure that moves in the right direction, and the carrot and stick incentives, so that we can ensure that we move in the right direction. So taking advantage of the good times and preparing for less favorable episodes, I think it will ensure meeting the targets on time. And I think we all share a responsibility, and we all need to have or make ownership of the problem. And I think that will help us all move along in a more coordinated way.
Governor and Sabine, I really would like to thank you for your time, but more so than that, you bring a degree of passion, expertise, and even, although you're classy people, you have battle scars that you're able to show without shame to the participants. So we really benefited from this, and we will make this useful discussion available to the supervisory community. We will incorporate as part of our training programs. And you really have our gratitude. Thanks for taking time from your very busy time during this very difficult time in the global economy. So thank you. And I will, gracias, danke, and also namaste, right? So take care, and we'll see you again. You kicked ass.